You often hear about these fundamental principles, things we almost take for granted in our society.
Right. Bedrock ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what happens when one of those, like, say, the idea that the law applies equally to everyone is really, really tested?
Yeah, that's where this case involving Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia really comes into focus. He's a man from Maryland.
And what makes his situation immediately stand out?
Well, it's that he wasn't just, any person facing deportation. A judge had already reviewed his case.
Okay.
And that judge specifically found that sending him back to El Salvador meant a serious risk of persecution for him.
So there was a legal finding.
Yes, precisely. It resulted in what's called a withholding from removal order. Think of it like a legal shield, specifically saying he shouldn't be sent there.
A clear legal shield. Okay. And yet,
despite that very clear ruling, he was deported not that long ago, actually.
and not just sent back generally, right?
Yeah.
There's more to it.
No, exactly. He was sent specifically to CCOT. It's this huge prison in El Salvador.
And it has quite a reputation, I understand.
It does. For incredibly harsh conditions. It's become quite notorious.
Now, setting the stage a bit, this deportation happened while the Trump administration was making claims about him.
Right. They were accusing Mr. Abrego Garcia of being a member of MS-13.
But the evidence for that.
Well, according to numerous reports, the evidence supporting that claim was, let's say, not very strong. Pretty thin, actually.
Okay, so this is where it starts getting really complex and where, listeners should probably lean in a bit.
Definitely, because this isn't just about one person's deportation anymore. Multiple courts have now looked at this, and they've consistently said the White House needs to do something. Specifically, they need to facilitate his release.
And that includes the highest court.
Yes, even the Supreme Court used that word, facilitate.
Right. Which, raises a huge question. What does facilitate actually mean when the Supreme Court says it?
Well, I mean, typically in legal terms, it suggests an active responsibility, right? You need to actively help make something happen, not just stand by.
But that seems to be the sticking point here, doesn't it?
It appears so, because initially President Trump made statements suggesting, respect for the court's decision.
Okay, some initial compliance signals.
Sort of. But then the actions, or maybe the lack of action from the administration, started to paint a different picture.
How so?
Well, later on, President Trump actually claimed that Mr. Abrego Garcia was now solely in El Salvador's custody.
Implying,
it seems, that the U.S. had no more obligation, like washing their hands of it.
that's quite a shift, especially considering what was said earlier in court.
It really is. Initially, even in federal court, there was this acknowledgement that deporting him was, frankly, an error, a mistake, a direct violation of that withholding order we mentioned.
Okay, so they admitted the mistake.
At first. But then the narrative just completely flipped. You had high-ranking officials like Stephen Miller arguing, no, this wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. It was lawful.
Wow. So they walked back the admission of error.
Completely. They even suggested the initial admission was somehow the work of, an internal opponent, someone working against the administration's goals. It adds this whole other layer of, intrigue and complexity.
And meanwhile, you have the judge overseeing the case back in Maryland, Judge Paula Sheenis.
Yes, and she hasn't minced words, has she?
Not at all. Her statement, to date, nothing has been done. Nothing. That just hits hard. It speaks volumes about the frustration.
It's more than frustration, I think. It's a direct challenge from the judiciary.
Right. Because she didn't just say that. She ordered action, didn't she?
She did. She ordered Trump administration officials to produce documents, to sit for depositions. Basically, she's trying to force transparency.
To find out what, if anything, has actually been done to follow these court orders.
Exactly. This isn't just about paperwork. It's about accountability. Is the executive branch following the judiciary's orders or not?
Which makes you wonder, is this just, bureaucratic fit-dragging? Or is it something more deliberate, a conscious choice to ignore the courts?
Judge Sheenis seems to be leaning towards that second possibility. She's openly questioned if the administration is acting in bad faith.
Bad faith. Strong words from a judge.
Very. Remember, her initial order demanding they bring him back was based on finding he was deported without notice, legal justification, or due process.
That's a damning assessment.
Absolutely. And she was very explicit about the conditions he faced, wasn't she?
Yeah, calling CCOT one of the most inhumane and dangerous prisons in the world.
And saying the refusal to act shocks the conscience. That really conveys the human element here, the severity of his situation.
Did the appeals court agree with her assessment?
Oh, strongly. They echoed her concerns, even comparing his removal to an official act of kidnapping.
Kidnapping, wow.
Yes. That level of language from an appeals court shows just how outraged parts of the judiciary were by the administration's stance.
They also warned about a loophole, right? A dangerous precedent.
They did. A really disturbing loophole, they called it. The idea that the government could just deport someone to a foreign prison to get around a court order.
And then just say, oh, they're not in our custody anymore, not our problem.
Exactly. The appeals court called that a path of perfect lawlessness. Just incredibly stark language, highlighting the threat to the rule of law itself.
So the Supreme Court gets involved. They affirm the need to facilitate, but maybe with some nuance.
Right. They agreed with Judge Shines's overall assessment that something needed to be done, but they stopped short of issuing a direct, explicit order compelling the return.
Why the hesitation, do you think?
Likely an acknowledgement of the separation of powers. Courts are generally cautious about directly ordering the executive branch to take specific foreign policy actions, so they used facilitate.
But that word facilitate, it left room for interpretation, didn't it?
It certainly seems the administration saw an opening there. Ambiguity they could exploit.
So how did the administration interpret facilitate?
Their lawyers argued in court that it basically just means removing domestic obstacles. So, if Mr. Abrego Garcia somehow managed to get himself back to the U.S. border or an embassy...
On his own, from one of the world's worst prisons.
Right. Then the U.S. wouldn't block his reentry. The Justice Department explicitly said taking all available steps to facilitate just meant removing U.S. barriers.
That sounds incredibly passive, almost meaningless in practical terms.
Judge Shines certainly thought so. She said that interpretation was completely unconvincing, that it goes against the plain meaning of the word facilitate.
She called them out on it.
She did. She questioned how realistic that scenario even was, him just showing up. It clearly wasn't the proactive effort the Supreme Court seemed to be implying.
And this brings us to the bigger picture, doesn't it? This isn't just about Mr. Abrego Garcia anymore.
No, the implications are much broader. For the legal system, for the balance of power.
What's the core concern legal experts are raising?
It's this potential for the executive branch to basically decide it can ignore court orders it doesn't like. If that happens, it really destabilizes the whole system.
The checks and balances.
Exactly. The whole idea is that the branches hold each other accountable. If the executive can just sidestep the judiciary, well, where does that lead? Judge Shines raised this explicitly.
And Justice Sotomayor also weighed in with a particularly worrying point about the administration's logic, right?
Yes, in her statement on the Supreme Court's order, she pointed out that if the administration's argument holds that they lose responsibility once someone is outside U.S. custody, even if they put them there wrongly, then what stops them from doing that to anyone, even a U.S. citizen? Deport them, have them detained abroad before a court can stop it, and then claim it's out of their hands.
That's a chilling thought. It undermines the whole idea of legal protection.
It really does. It strikes right at the heart of due process and the rule of law. The idea that the government can't just make someone disappear into a foreign jail despite court orders saying otherwise.
Okay, so let's try to recap the core elements here.
All right.
We have Mr. Abrego Garcia, wrongly deported to El Salvador despite a court order protecting him.
Yes, deported to a very dangerous prison.
Multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, say the White House must facilitate his return.
Correct. That specific word, facilitate.
But the Trump administration argues this just means passively not blocking him if he somehow returns on his own.
An interpretation Judge Shines has flatly rejected as inadequate and contrary to the court's directive.
And because of this perceived inaction, she's now demanding documents and testimony from administration officials.
Yes, she's pushing for answers, trying to understand what, if anything, they've actually done and why they're taking this stance.
Which really sets up a potential clash, doesn't it, between the judiciary and the executive?
A significant one. And experts, including the judges involved, are worried this points to a bigger issue: the executive potentially ignoring judicial authority.
Undermining that balance of power we talked about.
Precisely. And as Justice Sotomayor warned, the logic used here could have really far-reaching, dangerous consequences for anyone, potentially even citizens, if allowed to stand.
So it really forces you, the listener to think about the rule of law, doesn't it?
Absolutely. What does it truly mean if a presidential administration seems willing to defy court orders? What happens to the checks and balances?
Yeah, what are the consequences when court orders appear to be ignored? It's a fundamental question about how our system is supposed to work and whether it actually is working, something important to consider